Welcome to Ouch. Was that a ghost? This podcast may contain graphic material, which some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised.
Help me.
Now that we covered that, here's your host, Liz.
Welcome to Ouch, Was That a Ghost with Liz. This is my first solo case, and to say I'm scared is an understatement. So please feel free to leave constructive feedback, but don't make me cry. The case I picked today was one that always intrigued me. The Somerton Man. It's one of the most well-known Australian cold cases, and some people think it's solved. But even if it is, there's still so many questions that remain unanswered. This mystery became the focus of many professional and amateur codebreakers. This case has led to many wild speculations, including scorned lovers or Cold War spies, the time period being shortly after the end of World War II. International tensions were high following the start of the Cold War. It all started on December 1st, 1948 at approximately 6:30 a.m. on the Somerton Park Beach in Adelaide, Australia. That morning, two trainee jockeys were exercising their horses when they noticed a man lying on his back with his head resting up against a seawall. His legs were extended out and his feet were crossed. There were no signs of injury or any type of assault. One of the trainee jockeys went up closer to the man and saw that he was not breathing. The police were contacted shortly after and arrived on scene. They found the half-propped up, deceased, middle-aged man. The man was well-dressed with a fully dry, neatly pressed suit consisting of brown pants, a tie, a white shirt, a gray and brown double-breasted jacket, a brown knitted pullover, socks, and polished shoes, with an unlit cigarette on the right collar of his coat. He looked like a pretty average guy. He was around 6 feet tall, he had reddish hair, gray eyes, and looked to be in his 40s. The contents of his pockets were a bus ticket dated from the day before, which let the authorities know that he just got into town the night before. He also had an unused second-class rail ticket in his pocket from Adelaide to Henley Beach. He had a box of matches, a metal comb that was made in the U.S., a half-empty pack of juicy fruit gum, and a pack of Army Club brand cigarettes, which strangely had a different kind of cigarettes inside of the pack. The cigarettes inside were Kensidus brand, which was more expensive. Some witnesses came forward claiming to have seen him the night before, but thinking him drunk or sleeping, so they just let him be. One couple even said around 7 p.m. the night before they saw him fully extend his right arm out and then just let it limply fall down. Another couple claimed that they saw him from 7:30 p.m. to 8 p.m., and they said during the whole time he was in view, he did not move. They even talked between themselves about how strange it was that the mosquitoes were flying around him and weren't bothering him. They thought it was weird also that he was dressed like this for the beach, but they just figured he was asleep or drunk. One witness claimed to have seen a man looking down at the sleeping man from the top of the steps that led down to the beach. Another witness claimed that he and 3 others saw a well-dressed man carrying another man on the beach the night before the body was found. The police came to the conclusion that maybe he just felt ill and sat down to collect himself and ended up falling asleep and died during the night. The autopsy brought up so many more questions. It was performed by John Dwyer. His findings were that the unknown man was between 40 and 45 and that he died no earlier than 2 a.m. So everyone that saw him the night before saw him when he was still alive. So why wasn't he moving? The body showed no signs of violence. His hands were smooth, which led the investigators to believe that he did not perform physical labor. He had a very unique body. He was in great shape. He was well built with broad shoulders, a small waist. His calf muscles were very high and pronounced, like those of a ballet dancer. Another distinct characteristic was his big and little toe met in a wedge shape from years of wearing high heel shoes, riding boots, or being a ballet dancer. The man's pupils were very small, and his spleen was enlarged 3 times the normal size. His stomach, liver, and kidney were all congested with blood. Between the pupils, the enlarged organs, and the blood all implied poisoning. So the doctor was thinking maybe foul play. The pathologist sent samples to a chemistry lab, but no poisons were detected. The last thing ingested appeared to be a pasty, which is, I guess, equivalent to a croissant or a pastry. This showed no signs of being the vessel for poison either. The cause of death was ultimately listed as heart failure from unknown causes. Although poison was strongly believed to be the cause, they had no proof. The police were still trying to identify the body with no luck. The media dubbed him the Somerton Man. The man also had very unusual ears. The upper hollows of his ears were bigger than the lower ones, which is a rare trait. It's only seen in about 1 to 2% of people. His teeth were also very distinct in that he had hypodontia, which is a rare trait that's only found in 2% of people. It's basically not having lateral incisors and your canine teeth grow in their place. Authorities were struggling to identify him. He had no wallet. His dental records, even with the rarities, produced no leads. And the fingerprints did not come back with any matches in Australia. They then decided to reach out to the rest of the world, but no hits came back. The clothing he was wearing even had the labels deliberately torn out. His description and picture was circulated, and dozens came to see the body, but ultimately no one could identify the man. Now it's 1949, and the police were no closer to uncovering the identity of this man, and they still didn't know if this was a natural death, a murder, a suicide. And if it was a murder or suicide, why wouldn't they find the poison, and why were such lengths taken to conceal the man's identity? The authorities were trying anything, and they started searching all the discarded luggage in the area at trains and bus stations, which actually ended up paying off. On January 14th, a staff member of the Aniline railway station gave police a brown suitcase that had been sitting at the station since November 30th, which seemed to be the day that the man came into town. The suitcase contained clothing. Most had the labels removed, and I should note this is during the post-war time. Having second-hand clothing wasn't super abnormal. The suitcase contained slippers, underwear, pajamas, a red checked dressing gown, a light brown pair of trousers with sand in the cuffs, along with some other clothing. 3 items had the name Keene written on them, but it was spelt different on different items. Like on the tie, there was a T period Keene, spelled Keane, and on a singlet, Keene was written on it, but it was spelled Kean. And the laundry bag had Keene, Keane. There was a shaving kit, shoe polish, a toothbrush, toothpaste, a table knife, scissors, some pencils, a small square of zinc, handkerchief, and a lighter. A stenciling brush was also found, which is said to have usually been used by officers on ships to stencil cargo, an electrician's screwdriver, a sewing kit, and there was a Barber's brand orange wax sewing thread, which could not be bought in Australia. There was some stitch work done on the pants that the Somerton man was wearing when he was found with orange thread, and that orange thread matched the thread that was in the suitcase. So this seemed to connect the suitcase to him. There was also a coat with stitching that was done exclusively in the US, like that stitch work. And the clothing in the suitcase were the same size as the Somerton man was wearing. So it seemed most likely that this belonged to the mystery man. Theories arose that maybe he was a sailor, or at least he traveled to the U.S. at some point. They thought this because he had some items that were manufactured in the U.S., and this wasn't like today where Amazon can ship things from China or Japan across the world. Certain things produced in certain areas could only be obtained in that area, or if you traveled through there. They checked ship records, military records, but nothing turned up. The police did look into missing persons with the last name written on the clothing, but they could not find any missing persons by the name of Keene, spelt either way. And the police came to the conclusion that either the person missed cutting these labels off or it was left intentionally to mislead them. The only thing learned definitively that the man bought the coat in America or bought it from someone who traveled to America. In June 1949, an inquest was underway. The body was embalmed within a few days of receiving it, but now we're in June, so you have to think November to June. By this time, the body was starting to decompose. So authorities called in a taxidermist to make a plaster cast of the man interred. Before the body was interred, pathology professor John Burton Cleland was brought into the case to take one last look. He was an expert witness in physiology and pharmacology. Being an expert in the field, they thought he might add a different perspective. Professor Cleland noted how shiny the shoes were for having been walking all day in the area and on the beach, suggesting maybe the man was brought to the beach after his death or incapacitation due to the lack of vomiting around him or convulsion, the fact that he was just laying still when everyone saw him, which are two large physiological reactions to being poisoned. But he, like the doctor, strongly thought the man was poisoned, and he, like the doctor, could not definitively prove it. While looking over the Somerton man's clothing, the doctor found in the front fob pocket of his pants, the fob pocket, like that little tiny pocket, it used to be used to put like pocket watches in, but no one uses it for that anymore. He found a tiny piece of paper rolled up that they missed the first time. The paper read Tamam Shud, so they had another clue. The case over the years would also be known as the Tamam Shud case. They still did have to bury him, so on June 14th, 1949, the Somerton man was buried under concrete and dry ground to make it easier to access the body if he needed to be exhumed. A group of locals got together and actually bought the plot and a headstone. Like, how nice is that? The headstone reads, "Here lies the unknown man who was found at Somerton Beach, 1st December, 1948. The paper that had been found in the man's pocket was put in the local newspapers, and a local newspaper reporter, Frank Kennedy, recognized the font as coming from a book called the Rubaiyat, or the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. I hope I'm saying that right. A 12th century book of Persian poems, which gained popularity in the 1800s when it received an English translation and it was republished. It was a very popular book at the time of the man's death. Tamam Shud, which means is over or is finished in Persian, seeming more like an ominous message left by someone taking someone else's life or their own. The book, which is about enjoying life to the fullest while still alive, and when it's time to pass on, do so without regrets. This started the theorizing of suicide, which was brought up during the inquest. Also during the inquest, a professor of pharmacology testified of poisons that could be ingested and leave no trace, specifically digitalis strophanthine. Authorities started looking in bookstores and libraries hoping to find the copy with this piece ripped out, and they eventually reached out to the public for help, even showing the paper in the newspapers to say, "Do you recognize this?" And they struck gold on July 22nd, 1949, when a man came forward and said he actually had a copy of this book that was thrown into the back seat of his parked car, which was coincidentally parked a block away from Somerton Beach 6 months ago on November 30th through an open window, and oddly enough, it had a rip in the last page. If you remember, November 30th was the day that the man came into town. This man asked not to have his name associated with the case, and police were like, sure. So he is known only as his pseudonym, Ronald Francis. It turned out to be the actual book that this paper was torn out of. The paper lined up perfectly. And this wasn't just any copy, this was a valuable English translation, first edition from 1859. In the back of the book, there were some letters indented in the book. There were actually 5 rows of letters with one line crossed out. It appeared to be some sort of mysterious code, but the police had no luck figuring out what it meant. Some speculate that this rare book was used because different versions had slight variations, and maybe the code was significant with this book somehow. And that's why this valuable book was used. But it's still never been figured out. Like I said, this time period was beginning of the Cold War, and not too far from the area where the body was found, scientists were building a rocket range for nuclear missiles. Suddenly, the dead man with no ID, torn out clothing labels, and codes in a Persian poetry book was looking less like a troubled soldier and more like a spy mystery. The code was published in local newspapers. Professional and amateur code breakers tried their hand at it, but to this day, no one has been able to crack it. Some claim on Reddit that they have, but I cannot find anything definitive. And if the authorities don't confirm it, meh. In the back of the Rubaiyat that the police had was also another clue, a phone number which belonged to a young 27-year-old nurse. Her identity was kept private for years, but with her family's permission in recent years, her identity was made public. The woman's name was Jessica Joe or Justine Thompson. When they went to go talk to Jessica Joe Justine, who lived a 5-minute walk from where the Somerton man's body was found, she said she didn't know the man and she had no idea why he had her phone number. But oh yeah, there was a man who was knocking on her neighbor's door asking about her by name, and she forgot to mention this. Detective Feltus described her as evasive. When asked why her number would be written in the copy of the Rubaiyat, she said she did own a copy at one point, but she gave that to a soldier by the name of Alfred Boxall during the war. She didn't get into how she knew the soldier, but investigators surmised it was a love affair, and maybe this was a case of a jilted lover who decided to visit her and was rejected. So they were thinking maybe this is the man. She was brought to see the plaster cast because if you remember, he was buried by now. She took one look at the cast and was, quote, completely taken aback to the point of giving the appearance that she was about to faint. So much so that the authorities stood behind her to make sure she didn't fall. The authorities took this as a personal connection, and due to her looking just one time at the bust, and she didn't look back at it for the remainder of her time in its presence. She denied knowing him and refused to answer any more questions about him. In 1949, she asked that her name remain private out of all police reports, so they were like, sure. This theory quickly ended when the man Alfred was found alive and well in Sydney, Australia, and he actually still had his intact copy of the book. With no more leads, rumors started. Was he a spy? The code, the labels being removed, the lack of ID. Piecing together the information the police had, they surmised that the man arrived in Adelaide by train the morning of November 30th, 1940, then bought a train ticket, the one that was found in his pocket, to Henley, which was unused, and at about 11 a.m., he checked his suitcase at the train station. He then caught a bus to Glenelg, which was near where Jessica Justine Thompson's house was, and near where his body was found the next day. For decades to follow, the Somerton Man became one of the most well-known unsolved cases in Australia, spreading curiosity worldwide. In 2002, Jerry Feltus, who was a seasoned detective close to retiring, was assigned to cold cases, and he picked up the Somerton Man's file, as he was familiar with the case from years ago when he followed the case closely, and he decided to take another look now, 50 years later. He ended up reaching out to Professor Derek Abbott to help piece the case together. Detective Feltus went to go see Joe Thompson, who had moved more than 10 times in the decades following the start of the investigation. According to Feltus, anytime the story stirred, she would move or go on a trip. But when Feltus tried to talk to Joe about the case, she would change the subject, and when he kept asking, she got really upset. So Feltus, seeing her age, kind of left her alone, not wanting to cause an elderly woman such distress. Feltus refused to divulge the identity of the woman to Professor Abbott, and this in turn caused a falling out between the two. Feltus ended up retiring, and Professor Abbott and Feltus never spoke again. So, Professor Abbott was so invested in the case, he kept digging and did eventually uncover the identity of the woman. Thinking maybe now she'd be ready to talk, he reached out. But he was 2 years too late. She had passed away in 2007. In a 2013 interview on 60 Minutes, Kate Thompson, who was Jessica Justine's daughter, thought that maybe her mother was a spy, and in an interview, she said that one time her mother said she knew exactly who the Somerton Man was, but wouldn't talk about it again. Kate also claimed that her mother said she was fluent in Russian, but wouldn't say when or where she learned it. Abbott knew that Joe did have a 1-year-old son named Robin, who happened to grow up to be a dancer. Robin ended up marrying another dancer named Roma Egan, and they had a daughter, Rachel. Professor Abbott thought maybe there's a chance that the Somerton Man could be Robin's father. By this time, Robin had already passed away, but he did manage to get his hands on some old photographs and compared the pictures of the Somerton Man, and they did have the same ear anomaly. Other family members also believe that she may have had an affair with the Somerton Man, and Jessica's son Robin, who was born the year before the Somerton Man's death, was actually his son. Unable to get Robin's body exhumed, he looked for more relatives and found Robin had a daughter, Rachel Egan, and reached out to her. This was the first time Rachel had ever heard about the case, and he told her about the case and about his hypothesis. She thought it sounded far-fetched, but they ended up meeting up and having dinner anyways. They discussed the case, and he even asked to see her ears and teeth. That must have been such a weird dinner. He made her aware of his want for a DNA sample, and she was so intrigued by the case, she agreed to give it. The two actually hit it off, and the very next day, they were engaged. They married in 2010, and they have 3 children together. In 2015, Professor Abbott started trying to figure out how to get the DNA from the plaster of the Somerton Man. By this time, the hair is 70 years old, and they were only able to get about 2% of the DNA they would need to run the test. They needed a higher concentration level, which could be done with a tooth or an earlobe. With multiple parties fighting for the exhumation, eventually the South Australia Attorney General approved the exhumation. This was after 20 years of him working on the case. The police handled it and kind of kept the professor at bay. So the professor went back to the 3 hairs he did have, wanting to be the case cracker. He ended up reaching out to an American genealogist by the name of Colleen Fitzpatrick. So Professor Abbott and Colleen Fitzpatrick started working together. They got some DNA from the hairs found in the plaster cast, which was now well over 50 years old by this point. They uploaded the Somerton Man's DNA to the genealogy website, and the first match was a man named Jack Hargraves. Then they used this to build out a family tree. This being a huge task, they started with over 4,000 people. They started narrowing it down by looking for males with no dates of death. And one name lined up perfectly. There was a man by the name of Carl Charles Webb on the list who was born in 1905 with no date of death, and he seemed to have just disappeared after 1940. And oddly enough, he was related to the Keens. If you recall, the Somerton Man had a tie with the name T. Keene on it. Well, Carl Charles Webb had a brother-in-law named Thomas Keene that lived about 20 minutes away from him. So they went to his mother's side and started looking down the line to see who was still living, and they found a live relative named Antero Bonifacio. Antero was contacted, and he sent in his DNA, and it was a match. It confirmed to Professor Abbott and Colleen Fitzpatrick that Carl Webb was the Somerton Man. The professor stopped waiting for law enforcement to come back with results, and he made the announcement himself. While some people are still skeptical until law enforcement releases their results. Colleen Fitzpatrick, the forensic genealogist, is 100% convinced this is the man. So if this is the man, he was not a spy or a ballet dancer. The man was born Carl Charles Webb in 1905 in Footscray, Victoria, which was near Melbourne, Australia. He was one of 6 siblings. He grew up in Springvale, probably working in the family bakery, and as an adult, he became an electrical engineer. He played football in his spare time. This could have been why his calf muscles were so defined and they were mistaken for ballet dancers. In 1941, he married Dorothy Robinson. The marriage did not seem to be a happy one, just going off the documents. One of the documents, Dorothy claims she came home and the house smelt of ether, so much so that the neighbors were complaining. She found Charles in the bedroom, staring off into space, soaking wet in the bed. And he said he took 50 tablets. He did survive this suicide attempt, and in April 1947, he moved out. In her divorce decree, Dorothy describes Charles as violent and moody. In it, she also said he had no friends and he would write a lot of poetry, particularly about death, which, if you recall the book earlier with the piece torn out, was basically a book about death. And the next year, he was found dead on the beach. Leading up to when he was found, his parents died, his brother Roy died. He died alone. But after 70 years, he finally has a name, and a family to reclaim him. While many believe this proves definitively that it is Carl Webb, the South Australian police have not positively identified the Somerton Man as of yet. They also say they cannot give a definitive timeline for DNA test results. And some experts bring up the point that the hair that was tested came from the plaster cast, but people were making the cast, so who's to say it wasn't one of theirs? So until the police release DNA results, the man's identity will remain somewhat of a mystery. But even if it is solved, it's still one of Australia's most puzzling cases. Even with an identity, a lot of questions remain unanswered. Why did nobody report him missing? Why did he have Joe Thompson's phone number in his book? What did the code mean? And why couldn't the cause of his death be found? And why were there so many precautions taken to hide his identity? If nothing else you take from this story, check in on your friends and family. It doesn't have to be an occasion to text or call. Do it on a Wednesday just because. Thank you so much for listening, and you can find me on all social media platforms. And if you would like more content, you can head on over to Patreon and search up Ouch, Was That a Ghost? If you have a story you would like to share, you can email me at ouchwasthataghost@yahoo.com. And I hope everyone has a happy new year. Bye. Thanks so much for listening.
If you have a story you'd like us to share, email us at ouchwasthataghost@yahoo.com.
Don't forget to follow our Facebook page, Ouch, Was That a Ghost?